They're working in a world that has been fundamentally changed in a variety of ways. Number one, it's been fundamentally changed in terms of the ideas of man's humanity, of whether or not you have a tomorrow, but it's also been fundamentally changed in terms of international politics, particularly for those living in America. When America enters the conflict of World War I, America is basically a new country that doesn't really have an international presence. When America intervenes in World War I, the tide of war changes. America helps its allies win World War I, and suddenly America becomes an international power for the first time. This is a huge change. This is a very dramatic thing for America. We are moving from a country that basically was an individual country, not very involved in an international world, to a country that has different expectations and is a definite part of the international community. Now, part of that international responsibility for most Americans is humanitarian aid, helping out the world, making the world a better place. And part of that actually comes with helping out in Germany and Austria in the wake of World War I. Remember, conditions in Germany and Austria were absolutely nightmarish after the war. Children were starving to death. Humanitarian conditions were terrible. And out of the softness of American hearts, we began sending a decent chunk of our foreign aid over to help out Germany. Now, Germany takes this money, this humanitarian aid, and they use it to help to pay the debt to Europe. Remember, they get stuck with billions of dollars in debt. So America sends foreign aid to Germany. Germany uses that money to pay off their war debt. And then when Germany pays Europe, Europe actually begins using that war debt that is being paid to them to pay back America for the stuff that they purchased from the Americans. Now, what you end up with here is actually this really big, sad circle. The Americans are paying the Germans because they feel bad about conditions in Germany. The Germans are taking that money and using it to pay the Europeans. The Europeans are taking that money and using it to pay their debts for the Americans. So the money is basically going in one big, huge circle, round and round and round. That's fine, that's status quo, but keep that in mind as we keep going, because that big circle is going to cause us quite a few problems as time goes on and we move onward. Now, there are a few things that are really deeply different before World War I than they are after World War I, and in all honesty, than they are today. And I got to briefly mention those things to put some things we're going to talk about in a second in context here. For one thing, you have to remember that American money was on what we call the gold standard. Basically, there was a dollar's worth of gold for every dollar that was in your pocket. No, in case you're wondering, no, that's no longer true. However, in this time period, it was. Now, what that does is that limits the amount of money that's in circulation at any given time, simply because you cannot have more money than you have gold in a bank somewhere. Because of that gold standard, the currency and financial market works very, very differently. There was no minimum wage. People would pay whatever people were willing to work for. There was no regulation of the job market. There was an incredible freedom of business and economy. Basically, anything that people were willing to pay for, anything people were willing to do, got done, simply because there was a total freedom of economy. The government did not regulate. There weren't regulating bodies like we have today. It was a very, very different system of supply and demand. There was also no FDIC. Now, today, that's the thing you hear at the end of banking commercials. You know, the part where the guy talks really fast and he's, remember, FDIC. FDIC is a lot of things, but one of them, the one that I want you guys to know, is that the FDIC is the body that actually, basically, the government backs up a certain dollar amount of money that you place into a banking institution. So in other words, if your bank goes out of business, the government guarantees a certain percentage of your money in the bank. In other words, you can't just lose it when the bank closes. That's not always true. Prior to World War I, the FDIC doesn't work, it doesn't exist, and basically, You are relying upon your bank to be a good bank, to be reliable, and to not close its doors, because if it does, there's nothing that backs up the money that you have placed into that safe bank. There is also one other thing. There's a severe limitation of credit. Now, that's hard for us because we live in a world where credit is, well, gee, everywhere. In this time period, there's no credit for a number of reasons. Number one, there is really no infrastructure for credit. Today, you can swipe your card at a grocery store and it automatically runs this instantaneous check to see if you have enough funds on that card to pay for your purchase, charges your card, and there you go. There's this electronic system that we have that tracks everything and allows us to have this easily accessible credit. They don't have that. They have no idea what a computer is. They have no means of tracking credit except through paper, which takes time. Fastest means of communication they have here is actually a telegraph, all right? So the credit is not easily available because there's no infrastructure for it. The credit is also not easily available because people aren't demanding it. There's really no big need for it. Before World War I, it's shocking to us how few high-ticket purchases there are. I mean, when you're dealing with in a world where cars are not a big factor, really your house is the only high-ticket purchase that you have. In the pre-World War I era, credit is pretty much limited to your tab at your local bar and a line of credit you might have at the local grocery store. The credit comes from people who know you. It's not a matter of financing, and you certainly don't have a credit card in the way that we do today. After World War I, in the years 1919 to 1928, a number of those things change. For one thing, credit becomes available because there are a number of inventions that people really want. Automobiles are a big one. Cars become more readily available. They become more a part of everyday life. And of course, as you and I know very well, most people don't just pull out their wallet and plunk down the entire price of a car. So, because there's a big ticket item out there, credit becomes more of an issue. Financing becomes an issue. Also, as silly as it sounds to us, one of the other major motivators for credit is the invention of the automatic washing machine. We kind of look at that as, well, duh, washing machine, yeah. Well, the automatic washing machine didn't exist before this. And believe me, if you've ever had to do laundry by hand, automatic washing machines are amazing inventions. Most housewives of the 1920s feel the same way about them, and they want one. Their husband will buy them one. But they are expensive because they're a new technology, and therefore more and more people rely on credit for those, and then, gradually, for other things as well. Because of this reliance on credit, people are more willing to buy things regardless of higher prices, and therefore inflation goes up. Now, as that inflation goes up, the newly created Federal Reserve, this new regulatory body that controls interest rates, we know about that, begins to be concerned because inflation is going up, people are buying more stuff on credit, and therefore they decide to step in. The Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and when they do that, of course, there's going to be a problem because everyone's interest rate is going to go up through a trickle-down effect. There's one other factor here, though, that we have to talk about. There's also another factor, something we might not think about. That other factor is the stock market. Now, to us, the stock market is just kind of there. But in the 1920s, the stock market was brand new. There had really never been anything like it. And since it was just getting its start, since it was just a beginning, the stock market, like most new things, went one direction. It went up. Now, we look at that and go, you're kidding me. No, the stock market does not always go. Yes, in the 1920s, the stock market always went up. It was overall a steady climb. It was just getting started and everything was going upward. People saw the stock market as a sure thing. It was a way to make money because it always went up. Because it was a sure thing, everyone wanted to invest as much as they could into the stock market because they were going to get a good return. I mean, between 1929 and 1929, the stock market went up from 60 to 400. That means if you could have managed to have invested $60 you would have gotten $400 back. That is an insane return. Now in our economy, we would like stab people to have that kind of return on investments. Because of that, people were crazy for the stock market. They would literally mortgage their homes, mortgage their businesses in order to get more money, in order to put it into the stock market. Because, well, if you had the time to wait, if you could wait, the stock market was going to go up, and it was pretty much a sure thing. Now, of course, you and I look at this and go, I got news for you. Stock market's not a sure thing. And indeed it wasn't. But at this point in history, when people looked at it, they saw a sure thing. It was not as if they had decades of ups and downs to look at. They were looking at the beginning of the stock market, a new thing that seemed to constantly go up. Now, when the Federal Reserve, as I said, saw that people were buying more and more on credit, they raised the interest rates on loans for banks. When they did, then the banks raised the interest rates on the consumers. Everybody's interest rate went up. Everybody freaked out. They pulled money out of the stock market in order to be able to pay off their immediate costs in interest rates. And when everyone started pulling stuff out of the stock market, yeah, things kind of went really bad. If you look at the pretty little chart on the left-hand side, you will see a cliff. Yeah, that's 1929. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed in a way that no one had ever seen before. It dropped through the floor. It was basically a decimation of everything that had happened before. All the people who were betting on the stock market, stuff was going to go up. Their lives were ruined. They lost absolutely everything. Not only did people lose their investments, but the people who played it safe, they didn't play the stock market. They didn't get into the stock market. They put their money in the bank. They put their savings into a savings account so it was safe. Yeah, they did. And you know what the bank did with their savings account? The bank invested their savings account into the stock market. People, even the people who had played it safe, lost everything. People lost their homes. People lost their businesses. People went to the bank to try and get the money out of their savings account, and the bank was closed. There was nothing they could do. There are stories of people jumping out of windows and committing suicide when the stock market crashed. And we're like, oh, really? No, really. It was that bad. People had no idea what to do. Half the country had lost everything. There were people who had spent their entire lives saving for retirement, putting all of their money safely in a savings account at their local bank. They knew they were going to be okay because they'd been wise. They'd saved for retirement. Their retirement savings was gone. Over $140 billion with a B was lost within about a week. Over 10,000 banks simply closed their doors, taking with them all of the money that people had invested, which had been lost in the stock market. People's lives were ruined. They lost their homes. They lost their businesses. They lost everything in the stock market crash. Now, of course, there was an attempt at recovery. If you look right after that cliff on the graph, you'll see that there is a bounce back. That bounce back was a bailout package. Many of the richest men in America, Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller, they invested a huge amount of money into the stock market in hopes that if they put all that money into the stock market, other people would see the confidence of the richest men in America and they would get back into the stock market and their faith would be restored. The thing is, if you keep looking on the chart, you see after that bounce back, you see what happens? It was a nice idea, but the bailout package was a temporary Band-Aid. It didn't really solve the problems with the stock market, and indeed the stock market continued getting worse and worse. With everything destroyed, with people's lives completely decimated, people turned to the government and asked the president to do something. The president at the time was a man by the name of Herbert Hoover. No relationship to the vacuum cleaner guy. Hoover went to his presidential cabinet and said, okay guys, what do we do to help out the economy? And his cabinet made two major recommendations. Number one, put price controls into place in order to keep prices high. Now, that may sound really stupid to us looking at it through hindsight. You go, well, duh, people don't have any money. Why would you want to keep prices high? Then they're not going to be able to afford anything. Well, yeah, but the thing is, if you don't keep prices high, people will be able to buy stuff, but businesses are not going to have enough to make a profit. And if businesses don't make a profit, they're going to go bankrupt and people are going to lose their jobs. So the idea was to keep prices high, and then if you kept prices high, businesses would continue to make a profit and the economy would recover more quickly. No, it doesn't work. The second idea that's put forward by two senators, Smoot and Hawley, I love the idea of Senator Smoot, I'm sorry, Senator Smoot, he sounds like he escaped from a Dr. Seuss book. Smoot and Hawley say that Hoover should try to keep the domestic economy going. In other words, get people to buy American. In order to encourage people to buy American goods, Smoot and Hawley recommend a tariff or tax on imports. The Smoot-Hawley tariff puts a 50% tax on imports. Now, basically what that means is it's going to make imported goods, stuff from other countries, more expensive, and it's going to make American goods less expensive. Looking at it, that sounds smart. I mean, get people to buy American, more money will stay in your home economy, everything's going to get better. That is logical. The problem is that, of course, as soon as we put a 50% tax on imports from other countries, guess what they do to our exports? Yeah, they put a big tax on them. So basically, all of the money that America was making from exporting goods to other countries is gone. We lose that revenue. So yeah, you buy at home, you buy American, but the problem is no one else is buying American, and so you're still losing money in the end. Instead of getting better, Hoover's policies make things worse, and the Great Depression settles in truly, truly brutally. The Great Depression is a difficult time. In a way, it's kind of hard for us to understand. People lose everything. They live in areas called Hoovervilles, named after the president who didn't help them. The Great Depression is a time period when people desperately want to provide for their families. They don't want a handout. My grandmother taught me about the difference between a hobo and a bum. Hobos are guys who want to work for a meal or for some money. Bums want handouts. For that generation, for the people who survived the Great Depression, you wanted to be a hobo. A hobo had dignity. A hobo was someone who couldn't find a job, but they didn't want to take a handout. They wouldn't just take something you gave them. They wouldn't take a free meal. They had to work for it. They wanted to work for things and earn their keep. There's a deep sense of pride during the Great Depression. There is this sense that you need to work for your keep. There is a sense that Americans need to earn their way, and they want to earn their way. But the Great Depression takes a terrible toll on American pride. People can't find their way. All the doubts that were raised by World War I are only deepened by the Great Depression. America actually got a confidence boost in the wake of World War I. They became an international power. They thought that a whole idea of the American atom was really true. They were going to be able to reinvent the world. They were proving to Europe, hey, see, it wasn't a crazy idea. We are doing things the right way. Look how well we're doing. And then into that confidence came the Great Depression. The Great Depression shattered not only America but the world, because if you remember that money cycle I talked about, where America was helping out Europe and then Germany was taking the foreign aid and helping to pay Europe that was helping to pay America, yeah. You know what? The first thing America pulls back on when the Great Depression hits is foreign aid, and America stops paying that money to Germany. When Germany stops getting that money, Germany stops being able to pay Europe, and when Germany can't pay Europe, Europe cannot pay America. The money cycle stops, and instead of the Great Depression being an American phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, when the next presidential election rolls around in America, Herbert Hoover does not get reelected. Imagine that. Instead, a new president comes into place. He claims to have a plan, an idea for getting America out of this financial problem. He calls it the New Deal, and his name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. Now, FDR's New Deal involves heavy government involvement in the economy. FDR says in order to fix things, the government has to step into the economy, into finances, and the government needs to intervene and control how the economy works in order to make sure that everything gets back on track. The New Deal involves a number of things. We're not going to go into huge detail about it, but just a few things. The New Deal, number one, involves massive amounts of government spending. Basically, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, the government spends itself heavily into debt. Now, that's something called Keynesian economics. It's something that's still around today, something the government is still doing. Basically, the idea is that if the government spends a huge amount of money, basically spends itself into debt, then the government is putting more money into the economy. People will have more money in their pockets to spend on stuff. And as people spend more, businesses will do better and the economy will recover. Of course, the problem with that is that you have to have money to put into the economy. The government has to have the money in the first place to spend itself into debt. Doing that requires being able to print money, and if you're going to print money, you can no longer be on the gold standard. You can no longer have a direct correlation between the number of dollars in paper money and the number of dollars in gold. So America abandons the gold standard so that they can spend more money on getting out of this depression. FDR also puts a number of direct relief programs into place. He puts public relief, Social Security, welfare. Social Security, by the way, is intended to be a temporary program put into place to help all those people who had put their life savings into a savings account in a bank, and then those life savings were lost during the stock market crash. It was intended only to last for a very short amount of time to support those people who had lost their life savings. Of course, as we know, it did not exactly work out that way, but that was the idea. FDR also put something else into place, something that probably sounds familiar to you. You've heard it in recent politics. He puts the idea into place of the government investing into the nation's economy. He proposes massive infrastructure spending. In other words, he's going to spend millions of dollars on building schools, roads, construction projects, because if we sink that money into building America infrastructure, people will get jobs funded by the government, and you'll have more people working and the economy will improve. There is a very, very active involvement in the government creating jobs, because the idea is if these jobs are created, then the economy will improve and everything will go back to normal. FDR makes a government that is much more deeply and immediately involved in the day-to-day running of people's lives and in the economy. Instead of simply letting the government step back and letting supply and demand dictate the economy, FDR begins regulating. He puts into place a government-backed insurance system for money in banks. He begins regulating Wall Street, putting restrictions on companies, limiting business practices. The government becomes much, much, much more deeply involved in the economy and the day-to-day running of American business. FDR says that he's doing that in order to bring America out of the Great Depression, and certainly the Depression does back down. Now, if you read different economists, they're going to give you different versions. Some economists say that FDR's New Deal is what brought us out of the Great Depression. Without it, America would still be struggling economically. Other economists say America was already coming out of the Great Depression by the time FDR was elected, and that the New Deal really does not do much in terms of helping out the reform and helping out the recovery from the Great Depression. Regardless, the New Deal does make Franklin Delano Roosevelt very, very popular Franklin Delano Roosevelt is actually the reason that we currently have presidential term limits, because he was reelected so many times that they decided they needed to get someone new in office. Now, FDR brings the New Deal into place and becomes so popular not just because of, oh, look how wonderfully the New Deal worked. No. FDR understands that in order to do what he does with the New Deal, in order to create this new economic system in which the government is so deeply involved, he needs to have the confidence of the American people. And FDR recognizes something that has become so integral to our political system that we don't even think about it. But FDR is the pioneer, and it's important that you think about this as a new thing in the 1930s. FDR is the first American president to use the media, in this case radio and newsreels in front of movies, to create a public image for himself. Now today, public image is so much a part of politics that we don't even think about it. Basically, a lot of people vote for politicians not based on what their policies are, but based on whether they like and trust the guy or not, based on what the media tells us about his personal life. All of those things, it's all about personality, about the way they present themselves. Do they speak well? Do they debate well? Are they a cool person? FDR is the first politician to really understand and capitalize on that sense of politics, that aspect of politics. If you look down on the picture on your right, you'll see FDR sitting in front of a bunch of microphones. Those microphones are the leading radio stations of the time, which is kind of funny because most of them become TV stations. We know them as major networks. But FDR, for the first time ever, actually takes an hour or so on the radio to sit down and talk to the American public every week. Now again, we don't think of this, but for these people in the 1930s, for many of them, this is the first time they ever get to hear the president's voice. Before this, the president made speeches, someone transcribed those speeches, and you read the president's speech in a newspaper. You didn't hear the president's speech. You never heard the president's voice. This is a huge difference. This is a watershed. It's a total change, because not only does the president make a speech on the radio where everyone can hear him, but he's not just making a formal speech. FDR's addresses on the radio, when he talks on the radio, he actually calls them fireside chats. And what they really are is they are the president sitting down and talking to the American people like they're his neighbors. Like he's sitting in an easy chair in their living room just chatting with them about the world, how things are going, and how the American economy is going, and what his plans are. He is creating an image of himself as a normal guy, your neighbor, the fella you can trust, the guy who knows what you're going through. His purposeful creation of image sets a standard that other politicians all around the world are going to copy and emulate. One of those politicians who catches on to what FDR is doing and who begins copying this public image is an Italian dictator by the name of Benito Mussolini. Now, Mussolini is what we call a fascist dictator. He is a fascist dictator because he is one of a group of leaders who are trying to fight against a rising wave of communism in Europe.